Rita McGrath is arguably one of our top, if not the first, strategy thinker in the world currently. She has done a marvelous work with both strategy and innovation since 90s. And we're honored to have her to join us tonight to discuss about how can we reinvent or rethink our strategies. Rita, you're very welcome.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Hi there. I can hear you. Can you hear me? I'm great on all levels. Can you hear me, Tapio?
Yes.
Excellent.
We hear.
Great. I can hear you. Well, hello, Helsinki.
Go ahead.
It's a pleasure a real pleasure to be here. Hi. So I was asked to make some comments on the new strategy playbook, which I'm happy to do. And I think you have my slides there somewhere. Yes, no? There we go. So the overarching theme of this conversation is really that we used to believe in strategy in a thing called sustainable competitive advantage. And the idea was once you found a great position in a terrific industry, you then exploited that position for a long, long time. And what we have learned in the intervening period is that competitive advantages, as our previous panel has just illustrated, are increasingly short. You go from an energy company, right, that has a very predictable business. You have one customer, essentially, it's your rate setters, and the rest of the time it's all about operational excellence. Well, that whole model's been completely blown up. And so we really need to be thinking of a very different way of making strategy and making strategy work. So I think what happened here? No, I didn't want that. Okay, so I think the world really looks very, very different, and it looks a lot more like this. So this is an example of market share shifts in the gaming business. And so in the beginning, what you had was arcade games, right? And you had to go to a physical place and throw money at this refrigerator-sized machine. And each game was really expensive. And the game and the intelligence behind the game were combined. They were analog. So, the game could only function, as an entity. And then the next big shift that happened was you had a separation of the intelligence behind the game and the machinery on which the game ran. And that opened up a whole new vector of opportunity. So you started to have games you could play at home. You had games that you could play, wherever you went. Then the next form factor was you had little games, right? You could bring them with you and sit at the dinner table and, game away. And then you had games that could be played on multiple purpose machines, like Windows machines and so forth. And today, of course, we have games that can be played in the air, games that are played on virtual reality devices, games that are played all over. And so I think the pattern is what I think is really important here, which is this idea that we have these waves of competitive advantage, that you have a period of time in which an advantage is created, a period of time in which hopefully you get to sort of enjoy that advantage, and then a period of time in which it goes into erosion. And you can see that very clearly with the gaming kind of business. And that's really the world of this new strategy playbook that I was trying to illustrate in my previous book. So the elements of this playbook are, and I think the previous panel really illustrated this beautifully. So the first issue is we've gone from a world where we assume stability is the normal thing to a world where we assume that change is the normal thing. And that requires a certain degree of strategic agility. You need to be able to reconfigure your resources. You need to be able to shift things around. So that's the first point. Second point is we need to get a lot more comfortable with what I call healthy disengagement. And what I mean by that is the ability to withdraw resources from things that are either eroding or not really taking off or going forward. And in most organizations, even today, disengagement is a process which is really painful. We wait far too long to do it. When it finally happens, we're so relieved it's over that we just sort of shove it all under the rug and we never talk about it again. And yet, I would argue that what you want is you want a world where disengagement happens in a very healthy way, meaning everybody understands it. It's very transparent. We look for opportunities to recoup what perhaps was valuable about the thing we're disengaging from, and so forth. So I think healthy disengagement is going to become very important as a principle going forward. Then we have to think about resources. And Arun put it really well. I need to look at my whole portfolio. What am I investing in? And I need to manage that dynamically. And in most organizations, resources get stuck. They get stuck in divisions, they get stuck in projects. At a senior level, you hardly have a line of sight into where your resources are going. Then we need innovation, but innovation as a proficiency. And I would say most organizations that I work with, anyway, are still at the stage of what I'll call innovation theater. So we emulate Silicon Valley, and we have these innovation boot camps, and thousands of Post-it notes go on the wall, and that's all great. But we don't really take it to the next level, which requires incubation, so really building the future innovation in a very systematic way, and then acceleration. When you discovered something that works, you have to bring it to scale. You have to get it to really be something that can become part of your future. Then we have very new implications for leadership. We need leadership that is what I call discovery driven. Take in new information, be able to respond and react, be willing to accept uncomfortable data. That's really important. And so a leadership that really is inclusive, that promotes psychological safety, that allows information to flow, a very different kind of leadership than the sort of command and control, I tell you what to do and you do it sort of leadership. And then lastly, this has big implications for careers, for talent. And increasingly, we're living in a world that's a much more of a tour of duty world, which Reid Hoffman talks about. That what we're looking at is careers that may or may not be permanently tied to one company for a long time. And so it introduces a lot of new challenges with respect to how we manage talent and manage each other in those environments. So another big shift that we're seeing in strategy is we're going from a concept of industry, and there's still a lot of very blindered thinking about industries, to a concept that I call arenas. So with an industry framework, you're really looking at an established industry, established set of players, an established business model, and step. You're looking at something that is right, and human beings have made this up, by the way. God does not come down and say this is an industry. And when you're looking at an arena, in contrast, you're really looking at a pool of resources that's available to you and a way of competing that might be completely different. So I think the big learning point here is the most important competitor you face is often not from your own industry. It's some other industry that comes in and makes what you do less valuable or less relevant or less important to an end set of customers. So I think it's really important to remember that industry does not determine your fate the way that classical strategy may have thought it was. Now, my most recent book looks at what I call strategic inflection points. And this was a topic that Andy Grove very famously explored many years ago in a wonderful book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And he talked about an inflection point as a 10x change in something that you take for granted about your business. And the thing is, any business grows up with a set of assumptions that are dictated by what is possible at the time. So an example would be retail. Traditional retail for thousands of years has been driven by the fact that how much you sold depended on how much real estate you had. So all the metrics, all the dictators of success in those businesses were driven by how well you used that real estate. So all your metrics were things like same store sales and stores, sales per square foot and inventory turns and all that kind of thing. And once we had the internet, right? Once that constraint was lifted, now the metrics are different. The behavior is different. The customer shopping is different. And yet, if you're looking at the world through that lens of this industry that's been created, you can really miss those shifts. And I think that's a really important pointer to remember in these very turbulent times is the lenses that you grew up with, as it were, in a particular industry may no longer reflect reality. So if I take something very simple like the invention of YouTube, right, back in the, I guess about 10 years ago, 15 years ago now, and when YouTube was first commercialized, did titans of industry say to themselves, oh my God, this is an innovation that's going to destabilize the media industry and it's going to completely change the way advertising is done and it's going to dramatically shift the power balance between news organizations and everybody else? No. When YouTube first started, what was it? It was cat videos. A lot of it still is cat videos. But if you think about it, 30 years ago, if you wanted to get a video message to 1 million people, 10 million people, more than that, you had to be a media empire. You had to own all these assets. You had to own a production company, satellites, and big distribution arms. Today, literally, 2 kids in a garage with a reasonably priced smartphone can get a video message to hundreds of millions of people at virtually no cost. Now that's a real inflection point. It changes the nature of what we're doing in society. So I think one of the things that is really important now, as we think about moving forward, is that the whole world has been shoved into this world that I've kind of lived in my whole life, which is the world of relatively high assumptions relative to knowledge. So you've got a high assumption to knowledge ratio situation. And what I would say is human beings demonstrably are terrible at processing assumptions. We have blind spots. We have something called the confirmation bias, where we make assumptions because we already know what we want the outcome to be. So we go looking for evidence that we're right. We don't really take in facts. So what we want to do is really be thinking about how do I convert these assumptions to knowledge at the lowest possible cost and as quickly as I possibly can. And I call this discovery-driven planning. And the idea there is what you want to do is take a wide range of assumptions, which you want to test at very low amounts of money and time. And as you are creating more knowledge, that's when you could allow your investment to increase. So I would argue right now what we're dealing with in, just in business, in normal life, is we're all in this mode of trying to convert assumptions to knowledge as quickly as we possibly can. So I think that's a real principle to take with you as you, think about your strategy going forward. So a couple of final observations. When I first started in the field of strategy, all the cool kids were doing industry analysis. It was all order of entry and R&D intensity and those kinds of studies. And those of us studying innovation were sort of huddled in the corner for warmth because, we were looking inside firms and we were doing, individual company analyses and trying to figure out how companies work. Well, I think because of this phenomena of transient or shortened competitive advantage, strategy and innovation have really come together in a very meaningful way, to the point where you really can't talk about strategy without talking about innovation. You can't really talk about innovation without it connecting to your strategy in some major way. And then all of this, I think, has been heavily influenced by a digital overlay. So innovation today always seems to have a digital component to it. And so I think these three things are really coming together in a very meaningful way. So I'll wrap up my remarks here. For those of you that would like to dig more deeply, I'm on all the normal social channels and all the links are there. I do publish a monthly newsletter. And this year, all my plans, like so many of ours, have been thrown up in the air. So this year, what I'm trying to do with each newsletter is put together a tool or a concept or a framework that you'll find actually useful. So this month's is about how to conduct an experiment. How do you conduct an experiment in business? I also this time have been doing these Friday fireside chats, which have been super fun. I invite people who I think have an interesting perspective, and we spend an hour together on a Friday. They're free. They're free to attend, and just join in. You can find the upcoming ones on my website, and the previous ones are all on YouTube. So with that, I will turn you back over to Tapio.